spectacular. Right, copy. Looks great. Alright, this is deep wave travel.
If there was ever a controller that was considered the most controversial, the Nintendo 64 controller would likely be at the top of many gamers' lists. Its trident design was the brunt of many jokes, including those about how it was made for someone with 3 hands. Its design limited you to one of 3 playstyles at the time, either analog, D-pad, or a Frankenstein-esque mix of the two, and to be honest, I can't say I've ever played it in that last form. Third parties made attempts at fixing this, including Interact's SuperPad 64. I had one of these as an alternative to the original back in the day, and I've got to say I enjoyed it immensely. And even fairly recently, the Retro Fighters Brawler 64 controller was released, which is designed more in line with the modern controllers of today. There's also the HoriPad Mini, which is considered by many to be the daddy of third-party N64 controllers back in the day. It was compact, but supposedly comfortable. You can switch between the analog stick and D-pad with ease, and the general layout was rather appealing. Unfortunately, it was only released in Japan, and importing one can get pretty pricey. You're looking at about £50 or £60 on eBay at the moment, and a little more than that on Amazon. Oh, by the way, that's the used price, not new. Of course, I never had one of these. So imagine my surprise then when, in early May of 2019, I saw Retrobit's Tribute64 appear on Amazon for a cool and tidy 20 quid. It's part of their new Platinum collection of controllers, which will see controller releases not only for the N64, but for the NES and the SNES as well in the coming months. The Tribute64 has now landed on UK's shores, and I'm going to be giving it a run for its money. What is it like to use, and how does it compare to the original controller? Hello fellow gamers, and today we're going to find out how the Tribute64 compares to the original controller. Now, before continuing, and for complete transparency, I've got to state that this controller was provided for the channel by me. I actually bought this. It wasn't sent to me for free for advanced review, so it's my own money on the line if I don't like this thing, even if it's only 20 quid. So upon taking it out of the box, I was able to have a proper hands-on look at this Tribute64. Holding it in my hands, it's obviously smaller than the official controller, and this is noticeable with my larger adult hands, but it's about the size I would have expected it. Out of the 3 colours available, I opted for the clear blue one, the others being clear green and just plain red. I've always liked the idea of clear consoles and controllers, being able to see all the innards and what have you. It's a very 90s aesthetic to say the least. The analog stick looks to be a major upgrade compared to the original. It's practically identical to a GameCube analog stick, although maybe only slightly bigger. It moves just as freely and has a comfortable rubber top for added grip. All of the front facing buttons are all accounted for and have the same shine and feel as the ones on the original controller, and to my surprise they've got the same tactile feedback to them as well. The C buttons are a tiny bit smaller than on the original controller, but to be honest, I found during gameplay that this isn't really noticeable. The start button isn't recessed though, like on the original, but instead stands out proud like all of the others. I'd like to think the originals might have been recessed so it couldn't be pressed accidentally during gameplay, but that's not going to be an issue here, I don't think. It's far enough out of the way that you're not going to be accidentally pausing the game. Now of course with this controller, since there's no central grip, the Z button has been moved to the top, behind both the L and R shoulder buttons. I found it surprising actually that my controller had no markings on the shoulder buttons to indicate what was what. At a glance, you wouldn't really know which were the 2 Z buttons and which were the L and R buttons. I made an assumption over which was which and found during my first playthrough that I was right, but it would have been nice to have those marked on the controller like all of the other buttons. And of course, while we're round the back here, there's the typical card slot present as well for all of your memory card and rumble pack needs. The D-pad's been placed in the middle at the bottom of the controller, just like it is on the HoriPad Mini. I only have maybe, what, 1 or 2 games that exclusively use the D-pad, so I don't know, this placement might not be a problem. But I'd imagine anyone with smaller than average adult hands might find its placement a bit of a stretch, and it could be quite uncomfortable during long play sessions. But still, because of the design of the original N64 controller, most games were made to use only the analog stick anyway, so making a switch to a controller like this should be simple enough, right? I'll tell you what, let's find out with a few select titles from my own collection. So, what better way to start off testing this Tribute64 controller than with an absolute classic, with Super Mario 64. I tried it out first, I tried all of these out first, actually, with the original controller. It was a good way for me to be able to get used to what were the traditional controls again, and I felt it would serve as a useful comparison. Luckily, I can happily say that I took to Mario 64 like a duck to water. I hadn't played this game in a while actually on original hardware, and it was just the same as it was when I was last playing it. I've got no real arguments with the original controller for this game. In fact, the controller and game were designed hand in hand. The controller was made for this game, pretty much. It's the same as it's always been. Moving on to the Tribute64, that worked actually pretty well too. I had full range of movement, including dashing at full pelt, performing triple jumps and long jumps with ease, and I was even able to sneak up on sleeping piranha plants. I was even able to face off Bowser. Now, my aim may be a little bit off after all these years, but I was still able to take him down with no difficulty. All in all, this controller works pretty well with Mario 64. Now, next on the list, we've got another classic, GoldenEye 007. The original controller, it performed really well. Its age is showing a bit though, as it was kind of difficult to aim with the old analog stick. You know those alarms that you're supposed to shoot out and destroy on the first level? Well, as I was performing those subtle little movements, I could feel a grinding of the gears inside, and it was knocking off my aim. But of course, this is purely because the controller is about 20 years old and has seen plenty of action. It certainly wasn't like that in its early years. Now, as anyone who's played GoldenEye 007 knows, the controls can be changed around a little bit. You can even configure it to use 2 controllers at once. But the controls I've always used with GoldenEye is 1.3 kissy control style. It used the C buttons to look around and strafe like the default settings, but it moved the fire button from Z to A and instead used Z for aiming. The 2 shoulder buttons I had set for cycling back and forth through the weapons. Now, I did this because I'm likely to only be cycling forward through the weapons, but when I was on this playthrough, I was finding that I had to take my hand off the controls briefly to cycle backwards through my weapons in order to hit that L shoulder button. But I guess, you know, you can't fire whilst changing weapons anyway. Now, the new Tribute64 controller worked extremely well with this game. Aiming on it was an absolute cinch. Now, to reiterate, the control style I had adopted for this game all those years ago, the 1.3 kissy one, required the use of both the shoulder buttons to cycle backwards and forwards through the weapons. This time round though, it was an absolute doddle, because I didn't have to move my hand off the controller. I could just press the left and right shoulder buttons with both fingers. Aiming with this control style is done with the Z button, and thankfully with this controller, because it's on the shoulders, you're free to use either finger to do it, which means that you're not limited to just using your left hand for all of your aiming. Next up, Mario Kart 64. Now again, I've familiarised myself with the controls using the original controller first of all. Now to ease me into it, I thought I'd try out just the first couple of tracks, since I'm now too used to Mario Kart 8 Deluxe on the Switch. Now, the joystick's horrible grinding feeling notwithstanding, I was able to get back into the swing of drifting around these corners and taking aim on all of the other races on the track. I'm not sure what else I can say about this though. Once I got into the swing of it, it just works. Now when it came to the Tribute64, the new controller's joystick was very welcome when I tried this out. The movement was so smooth, and it made powering up the drifts all that more easy to pull off. But what I felt was letting me down was the placement of the shoulder buttons. The way that they're positioned, it meant I was finding myself using the middle parts of my fingers rather than the tips. I didn't feel like I could be as accurate with the drifts or firing off any shells or bananas, as I was losing part of the tactile feedback. Now I know I can still play this with the tips of my fingers, but doing so would mean scrunching up my hands in a rather awkward crab-like position. It's not ideal. Now next up, we're jumping into Lilac Wars, aka Star Fox 64 for anyone outside of the PAL regions. Now getting myself familiar with this again was just like old times. Flying your R-Wing, shooting down enemy ships, barrel rolling to avoid enemy fire. Oh, it was a blast. But that last point actually, the barrel rolling, is something that we need to discuss. Because typically on Lilac Wars, you would lean and barrel roll your R-Wing using the Z and R buttons, which would normally be under the index fingers of your left and right hands respectively. Sounds intuitive enough? However, when you move on to a third-party controller with a very different design, the placement of the Z buttons can be entirely different. The Z buttons on the Tribute64 means you need to offset your fingers to pull this off effectively. Allow me to elaborate. The two front shoulder buttons are your standard L and R buttons, and the rear shoulder buttons are both Z, so you can choose either or. But in order to tilt left and right, you need to place your left finger on the rear shoulder button and your right finger on the front shoulder button. Messing this up means that you're going to end up leaning left when you want to go right, or perhaps even not leaning at all if you accidentally hit the L shoulder button instead. Now I understand this is a remnant of a game designed for the original controller. I mean, it's not a deal breaker by any means, it's just something that you'll need to bear in mind when playing games like Lilac Wars with third-party controllers. I also found myself having the same issue with Lilac Wars as I did with Mario Kart 64, losing tactile response from pressing the shoulder buttons with the middle part of my index fingers. But hey, I've been playing the N64 for over 20 years. It's probably just going to be a matter of getting used to the controller's smaller form factor. Next up is Super Smash Bros, and I'm so glad I took this approach using the original controller first, as it's let me get used to the controls of these games before being let loose on the Tribute64. I've spent so much time on Smash Bros Ultimate that I feared that I was going to forget all of the controls for the very first game. Now I really like how any of the C buttons were the jump button, so you could just simply mash your thumb anywhere in the general vicinity of the C buttons in order to jump. But still, you know, I'm glad to see that I haven't changed after all this time. I'm just as bad now as I was 20 years ago. Now stepping it up with the Tribute64, playing Smash with that, you know what, it kinda almost felt like playing Smash Bros Melee on GameCube. At least in my hands it felt like that anyway. Any dedicated Smash Bros player worth their salt knows that the joystick takes an absolute pounding during heated game sessions. and I'm happy to report that there were no issues here with the joystick at all. Now, the placement of the Z buttons on the Tribute64 was really handy as well, particularly for blocking. Now, typically in Smash you've got two ways to block. You've got holding Z or holding R using your left or right fingers respectively. However, the R button performs a grab before your shield goes up. Now, if you prefer to block using your right finger instead of your left, this leaves you vulnerable for a very brief moment before your shield goes up. Now though, you can just use the Z button on the right hand side instead for that gratifying instant shield. So, for the last game I wanted to try out for this video, I needed a game that uses the D-pad exclusively. Now, since I don't have one of the top titles like Mischief Makers, I thought I'd give Pokemon Stadium a whirl instead. And this sounds pretty ideal actually, because what better way to test the Tribute64 controller than pitting it against the original with the red and blue Pokemon bout. I mean, it seems kind of fitting considering the colours of these two controllers. And here we go, and... oh. Turns out the Tribute64, like all the other third-party N64 controllers back in the day, doesn't support the transfer pack. It seems Nintendo has kept the compatibility with this pack a tightly locked secret, which is a darn shame. Still, no matter. The controller still works with the game itself. You know, navigating menus, taking part in battles, and even playing the original Pokemon games on the TV. Though you still need the transfer pack in an original controller to do that. So, having tried the Tribute64 with a few of the N64's popular titles, would I recommend it? Well, it's here that I'm torn, to be perfectly honest. Personally, I rather the shoulder buttons be a little longer so that they were more comfortable to use, and for the D-pad to be a little closer to the left hand side. But I can see what they're trying to achieve here. Essentially, they're releasing an affordable version of the HoriPad Mini worldwide. I also would have liked to have seen, after all these years, the transfer pack support. However, if this is due to Nintendo keeping that kind of support under lock and key, Retrobit can't be faulted for that. What I do like about this is the joystick, and considering the Brawler 64 is about twice as much over here in the UK, it's got a very reasonable price point as well. It just disappoints me that you still have to keep an original controller set aside if you're playing any of the titles that this isn't compatible with. With how unique the N64 controller really is, it's going to be difficult for any third party to come up with an alternative that ticks all the boxes. However, besides a few niche titles, this controller supports pretty much all of the N64's library, and I can't imagine any regular N64 gamers being disappointed after getting one of these. But anyway, I'm not going to take you away from your N64 games any longer. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you all next time. Thank you so much for watching the vid, guys. Liked it? Disliked it? If you've got a second, let me know how you felt down below. And while you're down there, if you want to see more of what I have to offer, go ahead and subscribe. I've got loads more ideas for future videos and I wouldn't want you to miss out. Oh, and here's all the other social media gubbins as well. Thanks again for watching, and you have yourself a great day.